1 Peter 5, verse 6 and 7. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you.
Okay. So, as I mentioned, we'll be beginning a sermon series through the book of Job this week. Be 4 weeks. It's a pretty big book, but it's actually something quite simple that's going on there. The book of Job belongs to an Old Testament genre known as wisdom literature, and there's 3 books that kind of fit into this category. One is the book of Proverbs, then Ecclesiastes, and finally Job. Now, the genre matters because it shapes your expectations of what the book is trying to tell you. If we read Job like a book of history or a tidy theological manual, we are almost certain to misunderstand what it's saying. Job is one big, long, poetic dialogue framed by a short story at the beginning, chapters 1 and 2, and then a final chapter, chapter 42. The heart of the book, though, is poetry. And it's some of the richest and most complex poetry in the Hebrew Old Testament. In fact, Job contains more words that only appear once in the Hebrew Bible than any other book. It's the kind of book you need to read slowly and have a dictionary handy. The book of Job wrestles with some of the greatest questions that you can ask. Is God just? Does God run the universe in a way that follows justice? What kind of a universe are we living in? And how is Job's suffering explained in the book? Now, many people turn to Job looking for help when they are experiencing suffering, and it's understandably so. Job offers one of the Bible's most honest portrayals of a person facing loss, particularly when that loss seems unfair. We might expect the book to give us answers as far as why suffering happens, but here's the surprise. This is probably something you're not going to be happy to hear. Job offers no clear explanation for why good people suffer. Instead, the book focuses on different questions. Not why did this happen, but instead, what kind of a world do we live in? How is God involved? What can we say about God's character when injustice and evil persist in the world? And so let's look at the book of Job. The book opens with an introduction. Job is a man from the land of Uz. And Uz is this place, it's way far to the east, far away. Everything in the story feels distant. In fact, it's a long time ago in a faraway land. And what's interesting is, in this book, none of the characters are Israelites. In fact, Israel's not mentioned. Even Torah is not mentioned at all in the book. There is no historical anchor in the story at all. And the author does this on purpose. It's intentional. The author doesn't want us to be distracted by the geography or the history or politics or even the cultural details. The focus instead is meant to be on the questions that arise through Job's suffering. We're told that Job is an extraordinarily wealthy guy. He's got lots of donkeys. In fact, all of his donkeys are female. And you think, okay, well, what does that matter? The female donkeys apparently are the really valuable ones. They're the ones that can be used for breeding. But he's got 7,000 donkeys. So this guy is really wealthy. He's got a big family, lots of livestock. These are all seen as visible signs of a person's wealth and success. However, don't get too attached to the kids. We'll get to that in a minute. We are told that Job is also deeply pious. Not according to Torah law. Again, that doesn't appear anywhere here, but according to faithfulness. Job worships the one true God and takes responsibility for the spiritual well-being of his household. Everything is as it should be in the story. And then the scene shifts. And this is where the author wants to unsettle you. Beginning in verse 6, the story introduces a heavenly scene that is not meant to function as a detailed historical description of how heaven works. That's not the point here. It's not a blueprint. It's a literary device that's used to disturb the reader's assumptions about God and about the moral order of the world. The author wants you to feel uncomfortable here. And so, we enter into the courtroom of God, and the messengers of God are presenting themselves and giving their messages to God. And among them is a character called the Satan, or the Hashatan, which means the accuser. Now, this is the first time that this title appears in Scripture. It's not yet a proper name. In Hebrew, Hashatan means the accuser, literally. Now, in the New Testament, when we get to the New Testament, the enemy is called Hadiablos, which is the slanderer or the backbiter or the one who throws accusations. The accuser in Hebrew appears again in Zechariah chapter 3, slandering the high priest Joshua. And in Revelation 12, John tells us that the serpent, the devil, Satan, the dragon, they're all the same thing. They're all the enemy of our God and God's people. Now, again, the point here is not to construct a full doctrine of the devil. The author simply wants us to notice a few very important things. Number one, that the Satan, the Shaitan, is a created being. He's subject to God's authority. He opposes God, but he is not God's equal. He enters God's presence only when he is summoned. He bows. He speaks. He runs his mouth a bit, I'll give you that. But he remains under God's control. God points to Job when talking to the Satan and says, hey, have you considered my servant Job? The accuser responds with a very familiar logic, something that's going to sound very familiar to us. Oh, yeah, of course, Job. Job's faithful. Look how blessed he is. That's how the world works, God. You bless, humans comply. Blessings produce obedience, produce blessings. But if you take that away, says the accuser, Job's going to curse you to your face. That's as far as I can get without water. Okay, take it away, and God, and the accuser says that Job will curse you to your face. And what the enemy is then introducing here is what's called a closed moral framework. We're going to have more to say about this in the second sermon in the series, but at this point we will say this much. It's a whole way of seeing the world, that is, you do good, you get good. So if you are a good person, good things happen to you. If you are a bad person, then bad things happen to you. And what's shocking here is Satan introduces this worldview, and God seems to take the bait. God agrees to a little experiment here. This feels wrong. Somehow. It feels inappropriate. I mean, why would God allow a perfectly righteous person to be turned into a guinea pig and then used to settle a bet with Satan? That discomfort that you're feeling, it's not incidental, it's not accidental. In fact, it's intentional. It's the point. That's the point of this text. The author of the book of Job is not trying to explain to you how heaven works. The author is interrogating a particular worldview and seeing if it makes sense. He's taking the deeply held expectations that people have of the world and have of the wisdom that's in that world, and is seeing if it actually holds water. There is this deeply held assumption that wisdom and righteousness reliably produce success, and foolishness and evil will produce suffering. And what's going to happen is that viewpoint is going to be put to the test. So beginning in chapter 3, Job and his friends engage in a long poetic debate. Is God just? And how should Job's suffering be explained? And so I will admit at this point I'm a little nervous. What I don't want to see happen is for you to just hear this sermon and miss the other three, or only catch another one, and I think you'll misunderstand where I'm going with this. And so I'm going to spoil the ending a little bit to keep us honest. I'm going to give away the ending. So at the end of the sermon series, 3 weeks from now, where we are going to end up is that God doesn't explain suffering. The end of this experiment, God doesn't explain suffering. God does not answer the question of why does evil exist in the world. But instead, by the time we get to chapter 38, God enters the chat and effectively says, you are not in a position to understand what justice even is. Your vision is too small. Your life is too short. The book ends not with an explanation, but instead with an invitation to trust. So that is where we're headed with this whole sermon series. And so I just wanted to give that kind of a view. However, if we back up again, let's see out of just the beginning of the book what we can learn from the book of Job right off the bat. Job loses everything. He loses wealth, livelihood, children, and finally his health. And he is left disfigured, grieving, and sitting in ashes. And that's when his wife comes. And his wife says, "Curse God and die." Now, that isn't just a cynic. That's not a cynic's voice. That isn't just bitterness or atheism even. It is actually a pretty coherent, though tragic, worldview. Job's wife even represents a particular worldview that's under investigation here in the book of Job. Job's wife shares the same theology that the three friends that we'll talk about next week, that they have. She shares the same theology, but she runs it in the opposite direction, and she comes to the opposite conclusions. So the friends say, God is just. You have had misfortune, Job, therefore you must deserve this. That's the way the friends are going. But the wife comes along and takes the exact same thinking but runs it the other way and says, Job, I know you're righteous. Therefore, God has failed. She just runs it the opposite direction. Her conclusion is devastating. If God does not uphold his side of the agreement, the arrangement, loyalty to him, therefore, is no longer meaningful. This is a transactional faith. And it's not something that only happens in the Old Testament. This is very present and very real today. Faith that depends on perceived fairness. Faith that remains only as long as the blessings continue. Her advice, curse God, is a form of moral protest. What Job's wife is saying is, let's withdraw allegiance. Let's question God's worthiness. Let's refuse worship under these unjust conditions. A modern translation that we might hear today is, I prayed, I served, I gave, and God still let this happen. If God, or even if this church, really stood for justice, then this would not have happened. This mindset doesn't come from just a place of cynicism, but instead, it comes from a place of love and loss. Mark and Elaine were deeply involved in their church. Mark coached youth sports in town and volunteered with the youth group, while Elaine led in worship once a month. They were thought of as steady, plugged-in people, dependable, generous, and faithful. And then their 8-year-old son was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. For 2 years, they prayed with urgency. The church fasted together. Friends anointed them with oil. Bible verses were written on hospital whiteboards. And when their son died, the grief was shattering. But what followed was much quieter and much more telling. A few weeks after the funeral, Elaine shared with a close friend, I don't hate God. I just don't see the point anymore. If this is how it works, if doing everything right still ends up here, well, then I don't know why I should even continue showing up. She didn't curse God out loud. She just noticed after a few months that she'd stopped singing. She didn't know when that had happened exactly, but she just stopped singing. She slipped off of the worship schedule and then over summer found that she had stopped attending altogether. Prayer felt like talking to a brick wall in an empty room. She wasn't making bold declarations like God does not exist, but instead, she would probably say a God who allows this to happen is not worth organizing my life around. This is Job's wife in a modern form. It's not rebellion and it's not atheism. It's nothing that flamboyant. It's just moral exhaustion. And it's everywhere today. This mindset is so persuasive today because it doesn't feel cruel. In kind of a weird way, it feels honest. It arises from love and loss rather than cynicism. It refuses cheap answers like, oh, this is all going to make sense someday, or other nonsense like that. And like Job's wife, it offers a shortcut. It says, end the struggle. Stop expecting there to be meaning and just let the story close. But Job's response to suffering still matters today. Job's response is different. Now, Job never calls suffering good. He never claims to understand God's will. He simply refuses to make fairness a condition of faith. In chapter 2, Job says, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? And at the end of chapter 1, after this first debacle takes place, there's that famous line where he says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job's faith persists amid the mystery. And as we'll see over the next few weeks, his trust in God will be tested through this trial. But Job sits in ashes because he's waiting to meet God there. In our reading this morning from 1 Peter chapter 5, it speaks from a similar perspective. Peter, who has known suffering, Peter says, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he might lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Peter's trust is grounded in the reality that God cares. That God cares for the brokenhearted, even when we don't understand. God cares, even when we can't see it. God sits next to us in the ashes. God cares for you. You might be in a season of sorrow right now, or a season of uncertainty where you just don't know what's coming next. Or you might know somebody who's sitting in ashes right now. While it's true that the book of Job has got more to share than just some practical tips, at least two things stand out to me out of this first part of the book of Job. Number one, Job's friends did their best work when they were silent. It's the famous Roy Rogers quote, never turn up a good opportunity to shut up. Sometimes the best ministry that you can provide to those who are suffering is just the practice of presence, just to be there and sit with them in the ashes. The second thing that stands out to me is that Job sits in the ashes after he's lost everything in great suffering, knowing that God is sitting there with him. And it's because God cares for us. Let's continue this conversation next week.